Welcome to the Battles We Pick podcast, where advocates and organizers talk about their work pushing for social, political, and policy change. Today's guest is Terry Woodbury, whose consulting firm, Public Square Communities, specializes in helping local communities facing fears, as he puts it, of things going south. Terry's had a fascinating career as a community organizer, tracing back to experiences fresh out of seminary in the late 1960s when he was tasked by a wealthy white congregation with catalyzing dialogue with Black members of a central Kansas community. I was especially glad for the chance to speak with Terry about the differences in relationship between organizing and policy change advocacy. It turns out that Terry has recently been deeply involved in advocacy on rural water and irrigation issues. The title of the episode, 20 Years Left, is the degree of threat that an area of Kansas faced due to the overuse of water by a small set of large farms. With all the consensus building and bridge building work that Terry does, it is noteworthy that he ventured into advocacy in a situation where he faced powerful self-serving businesses who closed themselves off from any discussion of change. Terry Woodbury and I were put in touch with each other recently because of a shared interest in the public square, though we use the term in slightly different ways, which we'll probably talk about. Terry earned a Master of Divinity at Princeton Seminary, but has never served in a pastorate or religious denomination. Instead, he applied that training to a career helping communities address their challenges and truly thrive. Based on his ideas about the public square and what it takes for communities to succeed, he founded the consulting firm Public Square Communities, which took local stakeholders through an intensive process of consensus building, planning, and mobilizing resources. Welcome, Terry, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, David. It's my privilege.
Yeah. Well, so this is a podcast about advocacy and organizing, but we talk more about advocacy, which is the side of life I come from and I've worked on. But Terry, you're an organizer, so I'm looking forward to looking at that side of life, that type of work for change, which of course is a close sibling of advocacy, and we can talk about how the two are related. To start out, I want to talk about your particular specialty with Public Square Communities, which has been local communities with real struggles. Please, if you would, tell us about your journey getting involved with this work and how you developed your sense of the challenges communities face and the keys to success.
Well, the orientation to this work came somewhat by accident. I was between my second and third year in seminary and really had studied myself out and needed to get my hands on something real. And a church in Hutchinson, Kansas, Presbyterian church, where I had done some youth work when I was in college nearby, offered an internship for me for 1 year. That was 1969-70, so that gives you a clue about my age, which I will not overly emphasize.
We don't need to get too deep into that.
So the essence was, this was the days of just after Martin Luther King's death, Bobby Kennedy's death, Angela Davis arriving on the scene with Black Power and big afros, and white people were nervous. And this church was for a town of 50,000, a very influential congregation with 1,500 members, city council people, publisher of the area regional newspaper in mid-Kansas, bankers, etc. And it was a very progressive church, and across the parking lot was the middle school that housed all of the minority students and the low-income people in the city. And the pastor said, here we are, a powerful church across the way from a middle school with Black and Hispanic and lower-income white folks, and we have no relationship. There's something wrong with that. I want you to attend to that. And he urged me. There was no job description. I'm still not sure why they trusted this 23-year-old with engaging in what would become conflictual. because he said, the senior pastor said, if I were you, I'd start listening to the people who are angry. And that's probably David connects to your he said, she said sort of model, because what I was hearing among my white constituency in the church when we would talk about Angela Davis, for example, I got a totally different picture than when I talked to black folks. And I remember an older black woman telling me about the Angela Davis Fund that was created. It wasn't officially Presbyterian. It was Presbyterian people in San Francisco, but it easily got connected to Presbyterian and became controversial in the denomination. So I interviewed people in our white church, and I interviewed some black folks, and the elderly black woman said to me, however it worked, it's the most Christian thing I've ever seen you white Christians do, is support the Angela Davis Defense Fund. And I reported things like that in a weekly editorial in the newspaper, and that began to create a lot of tension. I was giving voice to what I was hearing from one side of the community to the other side, if you will, and he said, she said, didn't get along very well. They wondered where I was getting this stuff and what I was up to and why this. So I think that was actually the beginning of an interface, David, between organizing and public policy. Eventually, I led a march in Hutchinson, Kansas, that led to the creation of the Human Relations Council. And it is still operating today, 50 years later.
So that the first response from that first type of work of listening and transmitting, passing along what you were hearing, I think I hear you saying that the initial reaction, and then I guess it went on from there, I'd like to hear you talk about, was that it was basically pot stirring. So, was there a segue from, the just gut responses to first hearing those things into more of a dialogue and starting to get somewhere?
Well, I convened a retreat about 9 months into this experience. A Lutheran pastor had begun to really engage with me. He was an older white gentleman. I was in a Presbyterian church. He and I began to have real dialogue about what was going on in the community. And he said, we have in the Lutheran denomination a gentleman from a pastor, minister from Philadelphia by the name of Lee Wesley, who has been commissioned by the Lutheran Church to run racial encounter groups within congregations and communities all over the country. And he'd been to one and said, it's very powerful. Let's bring him to Hutchinson. And we held a weekend retreat with 2/3 white, 1/3 black. We had some what would be called influential power people among white. We had a good representation of the voices of black. It was an intense retreat, and Lee was amazing. And it led to the creation of a coalition. We called ourselves the Coalition of Black and White Folk. And that's the group that led that march. That's the group that focused the need for a Human Relations Commission. And it created a respectable gathering of black and white people that the community did take seriously. So that was kind of my beginning of how organizing, if done carefully, with people who represent different components of the community, may create a new conversation that the community has not had before. I've had other circumstances and opportunities later, including right now, where that organizing takes more of a protest engagement. This was less protest and more gradual changing of the culture of a community. And that march was a bit of a protest, but it really was not saying no to something. It was saying, this is what we need. And it wasn't threatening and it wasn't hostile. So I think that probably shaped the style that I have. I lean toward consensus building. I lean toward trusting that people who we tend to write off probably are decent human beings if I understood their perspective. I have struggled to understand and believe and think like Donald Trump does. I've tried. That's a stretch for me. And
All of
yet
us.
I can see where the idea works in a way that if somebody hits you, hit them harder immediately. That is a
So when
strategy of engagement, but I don't do that.
when you say that you found yourself in a process of shift in the local culture, what form did that take? What sort of changes did you pick up on?
Well, I do remember that my internship was halfway through and it came to Christmas time. And I was by then writing these weekly columns they were called Church and City, and they appeared on the religion page on Saturday. So Sunday folks had read my column by the time they came to church. And I went to the church board and I said, they always had a big Christmas Eve service. This is a downtown large church, packed out, a couple of services. And by then I had engaged pretty well with a couple of black churches. And I said, how about we have a black choir be our music for this Christmas Eve service? I'm actually kind of amazed that the black choir agreed to do that. It wasn't exactly going to be a wonderfully rewarding experience, but they did, and it was tremendous, and the church loved it, and the music was great. And we had blended cultures for the first time in our church. We had no black members.
You developed the idea of the public square as an intersection of four key elements of any community, and looking at your materials, you've really, if I understood correctly, you really stressed that all four need to be involved. All four are equally integral.
Let's see, about 15 years later than the experience in Hutchinson, Kansas. By then, I was living and working in the inner city in Kansas City, Kansas, Wyandotte County. And we had a pretty organized group of volunteers. I was just one of that group of mostly neighborhood leaders, 12 of us in 12 different neighborhoods spread out around the county. And we were asked to put together a presentation to compete for an All-America City Award. And that's run by the National Civic League. I was not familiar with them before. I had still done organizing work, but to be eligible for an All-America City, it's not about performance and excellence in traditional All-America language. It's about, you have to prove that you have addressed three major problems in your community, and you have done it by collaborating among three sectors, and you had to be achieving success within the last 3 years. You couldn't use an old project that you did 10 years ago. It had to be current. Those three sectors were simply for-profit, nonprofit, and government. But it caused me to really think about how we had succeeded to that date. And sure enough, we had people from different sectors. We had school administrators, we had key government people, we had credible local businesses, we had a minister or two, and in fact, we had the sectors that they were asking for. Later, another 15 years later, when I started my public square communities, I had come to think about what's universal. I grew up in a small town, very small town in far western Kansas on an isolated ranch. I was now on the opposite end of Kansas in an intense urban area. I'd worked in mid-sized Hutchinson, right in the center of Kansas. I'd lived and worked a bit in Boston and around New York and Princeton before I came back to my home area. And I could, in fact, say to myself, every community has 4 sectors. Business is obvious. It's the retail, commercial side that generates jobs and money. So we associate that with financial success and jobs. In every community, there are schools, and it's a separate institution. It's got a school board. It's driven by a different set of policies. And their goal is not money, it's the future. Their entire ministry, their mission, whatever you want to call it, is about preparing a community for the future by raising children in a way that is future-oriented. And that gives the community confidence if their schools are good. They don't have to be rich if they're good. That matters. Another is, you termed it social services. I really struggled with the language. For a while, I called it health and human service. But the point is, their focus in common is the family. Churches, mental health centers, social agencies, Rotary clubs, 4-H. I grew up in 4-H, and I can't tell you enough about how that prepared me for leadership. Those folks are not worried about profit. They don't particularly worry about the future. They worry about, how are things for the family? Are we healthy? Do we have medical care? Do we have emergency help? Whatever it is. And that was my arena historically, and still is my primary. And fourth is government. Now, I grew up realizing that in every small town, almost, there was a public square. And in the middle sat the government, county courthouse. And around it was a square of mostly retail business. But there might be a medical clinic there. There probably was a law office. It probably related to the county attorney who ran over to the courthouse and advised the commissioners. But it was the idea that government holds us together. It sets the boundaries. And when it works and it's cohesive and the other 3 sectors are at the table with people in the elected office who know something about those other 3 sectors, then the community tends to thrive when the public square is healthy. And I think that's where we intersect. You're talking about, I think, governance. The act of governance embodies the public square. And for me, it's simply, where do they come from? Do they come from 4 sectors? Many governmental bodies now don't have those 4 sectors well represented. And when they don't have it all, they don't tend to lean toward good policy. I was a United Way president for 6 years and joined the Chamber of Commerce. I was advised that I do so as president of Rotary, or of United Way. And I get to the Chamber of Commerce, and the executive committee grills me. They had a separate meeting to grill me because they said United Way is hurting the chamber. And I said, what do you mean? They said, you talk about all the troubles, and then you go raise money to focus on the troubles, and we're trying to achieve positive self-image for an urban community, and you make us look bad. They had trouble understanding that if you don't have healthy families, ain't no way you're ever going to have a successful Chamber of Commerce. We need each other. It took an hour debate for them to accept me as a member of the Chamber of Commerce. I was appalled.
So is that an issue that you ran into regularly as you did this work engaging with local communities? Has that been a kind of a common business person's perspective to accentuate the positive and downplay the negative?
I would say, even in that urban area, during my 6 years as a United Way president, I saw that chamber culture change in that time, because we were also in that period of time going through a dramatic effort to consolidate city and county government. And that consolidation happened during my time at United Way, and I was one of the leaders of the consolidation effort. Once that happened, people began to see us not as a poor, broken community, but as a thriving, forward-looking community. And right after we consolidated, we got the Kansas Speedway in our community, which absolutely astonished the rest of Kansas City. The poor Wyandotte County attracted the Kansas Speedway and then a tremendous business complex around it. And the gentleman who engineered that was a very capable city manager, and he and I were friends. And so I was at the table at those kinds of things. And my United Way board said to me, "You can run United Way. What we want you to be is a civic leader. We're not happy with you just running this agency." So I also had a progressive board, and most of those people were business people. General Motors, Procter & Gamble. They didn't want another business person at the United Way. They wanted a person who could connect the dots in the community. So I think that reflects the health of a community. The rural communities that I worked in, they're so close and so interdependent. The school superintendent matters. The minister matters. The local teacher matters. The drugstore we have to have. So there's no illusion. There's very little illusion that a few people in the community can pull it off. And they sure don't think the government can do it by itself.
So I think I hear you saying that what you've run into more often than not is actually a healthy sense of the complementary roles of the different sectors. Is that right?
Yes. And I think that's a real intersection with my work in community organizing and your work with advocacy at the governance level. That the healthiness of the interaction of those sectors, I think it sets the table for the kind of messaging that is done to pass controversial public policy. The messaging has to appeal to all four of those sectors. And when sometimes bad public policy is only leaning toward thinking about what's profitable or thinking only about what's good for the schools, when you engage all those voices, you get a different message.
I described it in the little introduction, and I think I was accurate, that you're brought in when things are not going well, right?
Yes.
Did I have that about right? That you engage with communities facing very serious challenges.
The typical experience is the community is whatever the size of community. It may not be the whole city. It may be a subset, but there's trouble afoot. And typically I'm contacted by what I would call a visionary, a person who is positive, a person who is hopeful. They're worried that the community is going south, if you will, but they have a picture that is positive. And if they don't, it doesn't work. I've gone into settings where people are just mad and nobody has a real vision, and I can't engineer enough energy to make it change. And I fail in that sense. I have failed more than once because there wasn't enough leavening to get the loaf to rise. It was just all flour and it stunk. It was old. My process is a little slower than people expect, I think. In a community itself, whether it's big or little, I tend to interview about 30 to 40 people. And sometimes I engage a small team of people to help me do that and get them also listening. But I start with intense listening, and I do it in all four sectors so that I have a balance of whom I've heard and engaged. They are one-on-ones. I invite them into a storytelling activity. It's not data gathering per se, but I get them talking about leadership. when did they first learn leadership? Where'd they learn it? Some of them will say, what do you mean? I'm not a leader. And I'll say, yes, you are. I remember interviewing a waiter at a coffee shop at a restaurant in a little town. And I'd interviewed a half a dozen people in that restaurant. And I had made sure that if I interviewed one person and I heard that there was somebody else they didn't like, then I would interview that person in the same little restaurant. And people would see me. They wonder what on earth I'm up to. But they'd see me talking to people who didn't get along with each other. And I watched this waitress, and she was good. She knew everybody in town. And I said, I want to interview you. You know stuff that nobody else knows because you listen to arguments, you listen to opposition. And she was amazing. So after I listened to about 40 people, I convene a group of people from those I've interviewed, and I reflect back to them what I've seen and heard, and I try to define with some kind of language, this is the culture that I sense in your community. What do you think about that? And these are the assets that I hear. And I always ask people, what are your assets? What do you got to work with? And what are you working on? What are you worried about? And that becomes the beginning of our discussion. It eventually leads to a community conversation where we expand that discussion of assets and risks. And all the way through, we're talking about leadership. Everybody is a leader. And often that is not the institutional leader. Superintendent of schools has to manage an institution and it has to succeed. Doesn't mean that person can be honest, get out in the community, and get in trouble. So I always have volunteer civic leaders at the table who can take risks, who are not dependent on the job of running a school or running a church or running a business. And that interaction between volunteers and institutional people is really critical to this idea of getting to policy.
America's national political culture has grown. I think there is data on this, right? Has grown increasingly cynical, skeptical.
Yes.
Right. In contrast to the description you gave. And so just be interesting to get your perspective.
Well, I can tell you one thing that bothers me. The word community is no longer used as a cohesive word. It's used as, well, go ask the medical community. Go ask the retail community. Go ask the whatever community. That's not a community. That's a loyal group of single dimension people. They're working on their own agenda to succeed within their own arena. And that conversation tends to lead to conflict, not to consensus. When I say community, I mean you have the lawyer talking to the preacher, talking to the therapist, talking to the groundhog guy, and we don't have that. We do not have it. We are isolated.
As someone who has worked extensively in all the different types of settings, urban, suburban, and rural, do you feel like there's more that they have in common, those settings, or more that is distinct about the kinds of situations and issues that they face, or both?
Well, I think the factioning, the separating of people into subgroups is universal in all three of those. I've lived in all three. I've worked in all three. I'm now back in a relatively wealthy suburb, which if you'd asked me 30 years ago when I was in the inner city if I would ever live in Leawood, Kansas, I would have said, hell no. And my friends in Wyandotte County wonder if I sold out. Well, right there is a perception that the wealthy people are in it for themselves. They're taking all the goodies and going out south to Johnson County. And that exactly is what happened. White flight. out of Wyandotte County, left it being now one of the most ideally diverse communities in the whole United States. Wyandotte County is now a majority minority community. And they will tell you that's why we are succeeding. We now have everybody at the table. Johnson County is still, I don't know, where I live is 0.5% Black. And where I lived for 25 years was 30 or 35% Black. My son was on a basketball team where he was the only white person. So I think that we still are more isolated in those pockets. Suburbia, at least in Kansas, suburbia is becoming a bit more interracial, a bit more cohesive. Small towns, pretty fractured. Farmers got their agenda. They're hanging on because a lot of things aren't working as big farms take over and run the whole show. Those big operators typically are not at the public square. They don't want to be on the chamber board. They don't want to run for government. They're busy running a $20,000 operation. A 20,000 acre operation. So that we don't have the best and brightest people often at county government. And I've known some settings where the county government officials were there because they needed health insurance, and that was about the only way to get it because they couldn't afford it. They're a small farmer. That's tragic. We've got to get past that.
You shared with me an experience of an issue that you encountered, which was water use and over-irrigation and some of those large farmers really drawing down the local water supply to a dangerous extent. But the point was that that stood out among your experience as having been over on that advocacy side, on the side where it's about driving towards a decision, an outcome on a particular matter. So if you would, talk about that experience of trying to get a system in place that didn't draw down that water supply so dramatically and unsustainably.
Well, I was living back on the ranch where I grew up. Back because my folks had passed away. The ranch was divided into 3 trusts. 2 other brothers were the farmers and had been there lifetime. I had moved away but had been health manager for my folks in their elder years, partly because that fit more my skills. But I was named the trustee of the pasture cattle side of the ranch. It was a 5,000 acre operation. This was about a third of it. So I'm back in western Kansas, 40 years after leaving, spent 15 years there. In my teen years, we drilled our first irrigation well. And we were in prime place of sitting right on top of the Ogallala Aquifer, which essentially is an underground lake created by the water flow off of the Rocky Mountains down the hill, if you will. We were 200 miles from the Rocky Mountains. We had 5 irrigation wells in not many years. 3 of them pumped 2,000 gallons a minute or more. And it was so flat out there, we could drill a well, run a ditch 2 miles down the fence line, and it sloped exactly right, 6 inches per mile, maybe a foot per mile. We could run water 2 miles to a field. Open irrigation, environmentally a disaster over time, because after 20 years or so, people started to realize they were losing most of the water to evaporation. We went to pipes, 8-inch, 10-inch pipes carrying the water. Then we went to underground pipes, so there was no evaporation, and we got out of doing ditches and went to circles. And then we got increased technology and made the circles more and more efficient by dropping the sprinkler heads down 6 inches above the ground, et cetera, et cetera. But within 40 years, we had 500 irrigation wells. I'm going to say that could be the wrong number, but we had irrigation wells all over, not all over the county. 1/4 of it didn't have any water. And lo and behold, what started in the 50s as a dream, by the 2020, we had lost 70% of our underground water. The house I was living in had a 200-foot deep well, and we were down to only 20 feet of water available. And we were beginning to pump sand in the kitchen. So I could see the handwriting on the wall. It wasn't hard for people to say, we're going to have to do something. So a group of 12 of us, I instigated the effort. I couldn't be a third-party facilitator. I'm part of the problem, maybe part of the solution. I wasn't a serious irrigator, so in that sense, I was not even relevant. But we got the public square there. I did design it that way. We hired a third-party facilitator. We all agreed to put $100 on the table at every meeting and pay the facilitator ourselves. I was devoted to the fact that we all had to have skin in the game. We had the school board there. We had the county commission there. We had the feedlot, cattle feedlot. We had the hog farm there. We had dryland farmers. We had whatever. But we had trouble drawing the big irrigators. 7 irrigators controlled 65% of the water in that county. And those large operators then are the ones who have enough equity that they can invest in the large equipment. And so they have the 50-foot equipment, the 100-foot sprayer, the 35-foot combine, $250,000 piece of equipment. So over time, those successful operators might have 10 tenants that they serve. So they control all of that water of those 10, what used to be 6, 5, 10 farms. They may be spread out all over the county. 3 years ago, I sold the ranch and moved back to Kansas City because I had no children returning and I didn't want to become another absentee landlord operator. And the family that bought the ranch were cattle operators, cow-calf herd. And to get enough pasture, they were driving 40 miles a day just to look at their cattle. These farmers, I have a neighbor farmer who had farmland in 3 counties and was driving at times 20, 30 miles in between fields. So you get this whole different culture of big operators who are successful, who are known by others, but they're in a league all their own. There is some jealousy, there is some tension, but the point is those large operators, in a sense, control the future of that community because the state water policy was based on what it takes to satisfy irrigated corn. That's the most high user of water we have. That policy is self-destructive. That's suicide.
A small number of people are monopolizing the water.
Yes.
What recourse do you have?
Well, the recourse is, first, to admit we have a problem. And the folks that we gathered contracted with the Kansas Geological Society, not contracted financially, used their resources to paint very clearly the exact picture of where was the water throughout our county. There are water wells all over the state that measure water tables and report annually. We had them run technological data where they could project out into the future how long will we have enough water to even have a town that can pump water? Our own town has 3 or 4 wells out several miles just trying to find enough water to pump into town. And that water gets contaminated at certain times of the year when the chemicals from the farming get into the water. And there are times that Leota, Kansas, where I lived, would have a notice that it was not safe. You needed to boil your water for the next 2 weeks. It's that desperate. But it's like an addiction.
So the hydrologists are able to clearly show you how serious the problem is.
Yep. And they said basically we had 20 years left and we'd be shutting the whole thing down. First thing that would shut down is feedlots, because if you quit having corn, you quit having feed for the feedlots, then you shut the feedlot down, which has 150,000 head in it, and it is a significant employer, and then you lose employment, and then the school goes, and then the hospital goes, and then the grocery store closes, and we could all picture what would happen.
That'll get your attention.
Yes. So it didn't come about saving water. It called, you want to save your community and still have a place? And what's going to happen to your 25,000 acre operation if the people you turn it over to have to live 75 miles away in Garden City and don't have a post office and don't have a grocery store? How are you going to attract 3 more generations to come back to the family farm? So basically, we got a group of people who own the problem, who could live with the grief of what would happen if they didn't do something. It really became a kind of funeral. I happen to still be a clergy person, and my specialty probably is funerals. If you get in touch with your grief and you are honest about your grief, on the other side of that is something called the resurrection, called hope, called potential, but you got to go through the grief. And we worked through it. And we brought in a facilitator who happened to be a Baptist pastor from Salina that I met through, wasn't me, met one of our big providers, had lived in Salina, and said, I know the guy that can take us through this process. We did it. We ran all the scenarios. We came up with, we needed to stop 29%. We needed to drop 29% the current use of irrigation. We also brought in every technology advocate we could find, and they showed us that there were much better ways to manage those circles. We could be much more efficient. They showed people how much water we were wasting and how the water was actually leaching out the very chemicals that we put on the ground. So we were doing self-destructive stuff. During Governor Brownback's time, he had a farm background and he could see the problem. And he helped create through the legislature something called Water Conservation Associations, WCAs. Any family or 2 families, they didn't even have to be contiguous properties, could create a WCA, articulate the problem they were addressing, and have a solution. And if it was viable, the state water board would officially call them a WCA, and they had to track what they were doing and show the results. We decided to create a countywide WCA. We got about 20% of the irrigators to join, but none of the big ones initially. But even among those, within 2 years, we could prove, in the language of business, if you reduced the inputs that you were wasting, namely water and chemicals, if you got that system fine-tuned, you could irrigate less, do it better with better technology. You weren't going to have 200 bushel corn. You might have 160 bushel corn. So you wouldn't have bragging rights when you got to the coffee shop at 6:30 in the morning. We're joking, but that's exactly what was driving. You wanted to show up and say you got 200 bushel. And in the end, we proved that you actually made more money using less water, better technology, and driving it with data. There are monitors that you can put in your ground at different parts of that circle you're irrigating, and it'll communicate to your cell phone exactly what the groundwater level is and can tell you when to shut off your well And don't wait until your neighbor shuts his off because you're afraid he'll beat you. Shut it off at the right time. And we proved, I wasn't an irrigator.
When you create a water conservation association, though, you are imposing a constraint on water use, a mandatory constraint on water use, correct?
No. The WCA was voluntary. So in effect, it was a pilot project. And all the while, we're running this pilot in one county of the 5 counties in our groundwater management district. We are reporting to the GMD what we're learning from our experiment. And after 2 years, we proved to them. Go ahead.
I just want to understand. So this is a regime that generates more information and a fuller sense of the options and real analysis of what those options, how they would play out. And so rather than a mandatory limit on use, what this is doing for you is resources to show persuasively, what the trends have been, where that leads, and how conservation can be achieved. Is that basically how?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So as our voluntary group was learning over a 2, 3, 4 year period, we were also sharing the results of that at the annual meeting of the Groundwater Management District. So 5 counties worth of farmers were learning from 15 or 20 farmers, irrigators in Wichita County, which was one of the 5. And at those same meetings, we were having technology folks show up and have booths and show people what they could be doing, how to use the water monitors, how to change their use of irrigation equipment. These are farmers.
It's like ag extension.
Yes, exactly. Okay. We were kind of a voluntary ag extension, if you look at it that way. We were not officially tied to K-State, which is our agricultural college, but we were using K-State's resources. We were using the ag department's expertise to teach us. So after 2 years, we proved to the water board that there was a viable result here. We could reduce water use dramatically and at the same time use technology better. And in the end, we didn't lose money. In fact, in many cases, we made more. And we had a very technical system that is hard to explain except to say that the system meant if you had to use 29% less water to be a part of it and have it measured. And if it was a wet summer and you cut back by 32%, that 3% savings you got to put in the bank, just like money. And next year, when it was dry, you could use your 3% you had saved. So it within 2 or 3 years, those people had already saved up water. They had gone past what they estimated. We took that then to the GMD, the Groundwater District, and just this year, it took 4 years total. The GMD took that model, tweaked it a little bit, and passed the policy, and it is now institutional. You have to cut back or you're penalized financially. And the model is actually fine-tuned to all 5 counties. The water underground is not the same in every county. That made it very difficult. But with the help of the geologic people, the GMD policy that was approved just about 3 months ago actually fine-tunes that to all 5 counties, exactly what they need to do to save their community. And it is now the first official 5-county new water policy in Kansas.
So the association generates the information and analysis in the district. Ultimately, after some time, draws on the information to impose the limits and make a plan. Before I let you go, I want to give you a chance to just share any of the broader observations about the work of organizing and key precepts about doing that work that that have come clear to you over the years.
Well, I do still find the public square concept of 4 sectors very helpful. It gives a framework to think about who you want to bring to the table. And it's not your friends. It's people who are capable in those arenas. And it's important to get diverse opinions at the table from the beginning. That's huge. It's not comfortable. We want to just get with our friends, listen to what we already know, and think that's going to work. And it obviously isn't working. I agree with your work and your learning that local change, local policy is easier to develop, much easier than state and federal. Ideology slips to the side when we start talking to our neighbor. People you've known forever, people who have gone to school with your children are hard to beat up on. So that local place to start, I think, is very helpful. I've worked with people at the national and regional level, politicians. They are incredibly discouraged. Just had a good friend run for Senate. He got cynical through the process of running because of the way the Democratic and the Republican parties operate. It is institutionalized at the top, and if you don't do what they say, they don't support you. It's terrible, and I'd say that to anybody in the Republican or Democratic Party. We got to change that system. So local is very hopeful. That's the other thing that I've learned. You can make local change with people you know.
That's terrific advice. The only defense that I would make of the Democratic Party, of which I'm a part, is at least we didn't try to mount a coup and overthrow the government. So we got that going for us.
Right.
But this has been terrific. Exactly what I was looking for. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom.
Should I admit to you that I'm a Republican?
Who loves a good old fashioned moderate Republican more than me? The problem is they're disappearing. I think when we look at the reality of today's Republican Party,
yes,
it is way more different than alike with how it used to
Absolutely.
be. That's, I think,
my longtime father, county commissioner, Republican, would not recognize the current Republican Party, and he would not be a part of it.
The people telling us most clearly, most loudly, from Nicole Wallace to Stuart Stevens to Michael Steele, the ones telling us we have to beat their former party are the former Republicans, and that's just where we find ourselves. And of course, that's a much longer discussion coming up here at the end, but I've enjoyed this a great deal and appreciate it.
Thank you. Enjoyed meeting you in this new way.